The sun hung low in the sky, casting long golden shadows over the open desert highway. Clint Eastwood rode alone, the deep rumble of his motorcycle the only sound breaking the stillness of the evening. The wind carried the scent of dry earth and the distant hum of cicadas, a reminder of how far he had come from the chaos of Hollywood. At his age, he had nothing to prove, only a quiet appreciation for the road, solitude, and the kind of freedom that only a motorcycle ride through the desert could bring. After hours on the road, he spotted a small roadside diner, the kind that seemed frozen in time. A neon sign flickered above the entrance, and a few rusted-out trucks sat in the dusty lot. He pulled in, the gravel crunching beneath his tires, and parked near the entrance. As he swung his leg over the bike, he took a slow, measured breath. A simple cup of coffee and a little rest, just what he needed. Inside, the diner had an old charm to it. The checkered floor, the faded leather booths, the smell of fresh coffee, it all felt familiar. A few locals sat at the counter, their conversations hushed as he walked in. Clint was used to being recognized, though he never made a big deal of it. Most people respected his space. He nodded to the waitress, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, who quickly poured him a steaming cup of black coffee. As he settled into his seat by the window, the peaceful atmosphere was shattered by the low growl of motorcycles pulling into the lot. The headlights of a half-dozen bikes cut through the diner's windows, followed by the unmistakable sound of boots hitting gravel. Clint sipped his coffee, calm and unfazed. A few moments later, the door swung open, and in walked a group of bikers, their leather jackets worn and their expressions smug. They carried themselves with the kind of arrogance that came from knowing most people would move out of their way. The leader, a tall man with a thick beard and a heavy chain around his neck, scanned the room before locking eyes with Clint. Well, he said with a smirk, his voice deep and rough. Didn't expect to see a Hollywood cowboy out here all alone. Clint didn't respond. He simply took another sip of his coffee, his expression unreadable. The bikers exchanged glances, amused by his silence. One of them, a younger man with tattoos running up his arms, stepped closer. You don't talk much, huh? What's the matter, old man? Cat got your tongue? A few of the diner's customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The waitress hesitated, unsure whether to step in. Clint, however, remained calm, his eyes steady as he placed his cup down. The leader chuckled, pulling up a chair and turning it backward before sitting down. Come on now, he said. We're just being friendly. You look like you've seen some things in your day. Maybe we ought to have a little chat. Clint studied the man for a moment before finally speaking, his voice low and deliberate. Not interested. That was all he said. 2 words. But the way he said them sent a ripple through the room. The leader's smirk faltered for just a second before he let out a laugh. Oh, I get it. You think you're too good for us? He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. Or maybe, you're just scared. A thick silence settled over the diner. The air felt heavier, charged with unspoken tension. The other bikers shifted, clearly enjoying the scene, expecting Clint to squirm under the pressure. But Clint didn't flinch. He didn't change his expression. He simply stared back, his gaze steady, unmoving. The leader tapped his fingers against the table. You know, respect is earned out here. And when someone talks to you, you answer. Clint tilted his head slightly, his lips pressing into a thin line. That so? The leader narrowed his eyes. Yeah. That's so. A long pause followed. Then, Clint took another slow sip of his coffee before setting it down again, this time with just the faintest sound of the cup meeting the saucer. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement, but something about it made the air shift. The bikers, once amused, now seemed slightly unsure. Something about this man, this quiet, weathered figure, didn't sit right. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't afraid. And that, more than anything, made them uneasy. The leader scoffed, pushing back from the table. You know what? Maybe you're not worth the trouble. He stood up, stretching his arms. But let's hope you don't run into us again on the road. Might not be so friendly next time. With that, he turned to leave, his crew following him. The tension in the diner eased just slightly, but Clint didn't move. Just before the bikers reached the door, the youngest one hesitated. Something in him made him glance back at Clint, as if he saw something the others didn't. Clint met his gaze, his expression unreadable. The door swung shut, and the roar of the bikes faded into the night. The waitress let out a shaky breath. "You all right, sir?" Clint gave a small nod. "Fine." But even as he finished his coffee, he knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The night had settled over the desert, cool and quiet, but Clint Eastwood could still hear the low rumble of motorcycles in the distance. He knew men like that. He'd seen them before, loud, aggressive, always looking to prove something. But he also knew something they didn't. Real power didn't come from intimidation or numbers. It came from discipline, patience, and knowing when to act. Finishing the last sip of his coffee, Clint stood, placing a few bills on the counter. The waitress, still shaken, gave him a look of gratitude. "Sure you don't want to wait a bit?" she asked, glancing out the window as if she could still feel the presence of those bikers lingering in the air. Clint shook his head. "I'll be fine." She hesitated before nodding. "Just, be careful out there." Clint simply gave her a small nod before stepping outside. The air was cooler now, carrying the scent of desert sage and asphalt. His motorcycle sat right where he left it, gleaming under the flickering neon light of the diner's sign. He took a slow breath, listening. Nothing but the sound of the wind sweeping through the night. He swung his leg over the bike, adjusting his grip on the handlebars, and kicked the engine to life. The familiar rumble settled under him like an old friend, steady and sure. He pulled out of the lot and onto the highway, the empty road stretching ahead under the pale glow of the moon. For the first few miles, the ride was peaceful, just him and the open desert. But then, from somewhere behind, the deep growl of engines reached his ears. Clint didn't look back. He didn't need to. They were following him. A lesser man might have panicked, might have twisted the throttle and tried to outrun them. But Clint had learned long ago that fear was the quickest way to lose control. Instead, he kept his speed steady, letting them make their move first. The bikers closed in, their headlights flashing in his mirrors. Then, just as he expected, they flanked him, two on his left, two on his right, with their leader trailing just behind. The young one, the one who had hesitated at the diner, wasn't among them. The leader pulled up next to him, his bike roaring as he motioned for Clint to pull over. His grin was wide, full of arrogance. He thought he had Clint exactly where he wanted him. Clint stayed silent, his hands steady on the grips. The leader's smirk faded. "I said pull over, old man," he shouted over the wind. Clint didn't react. He simply glanced at the road ahead, an open stretch with nothing but sand and scrub on either side. A good place to handle things if it came to that. The leader growled in frustration before signaling to his men. Two of them sped up, moving to cut Clint off. That was their mistake. In a movement so fast it seemed effortless, Clint shifted his weight, twisting the throttle just enough to avoid the trap. His bike shot forward smoothly, leaving the two bikers scrambling to adjust. The leader cursed, speeding up to keep pace. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Clint finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "That's your mistake." Before the words even fully registered, Clint made his move. With precision and skill honed from years of training, he feinted to the left before suddenly braking, causing the leader to overshoot him. In the same instant, Clint shifted his balance and executed a controlled side kick, right into the handlebar of the closest biker. The impact was clean, sharp, and perfectly timed. The biker lost control, his front wheel wobbling before he veered off the road, skidding to a stop in the dirt. He wasn't hurt, Clint made sure of that, but he was definitely out of the fight. The others hesitated, their confidence shaken. The leader recovered, fury in his eyes. He pulled ahead, angling his bike to cut Clint off directly. But Clint had already anticipated it. As the leader lunged forward, Clint leaned to the side, using the momentum to let the biker's own weight work against him. He reached out with controlled precision, gripping the leader's jacket and using his own speed to throw him off balance. The leader's bike wobbled violently before he lost control, skidding sideways and crashing into the dirt. He rolled a few times before coming to a stop, groaning as he struggled to sit up. The remaining bikers, now clearly unsure of themselves, slowed. Their whole attitude had shifted. They weren't dealing with an ordinary man, they were dealing with someone who had skill, control, and the kind of presence that couldn't be rattled. Clint eased his bike to a stop, planting his feet firmly on the ground. He turned, looking at the leader who was still on his hands and knees, coughing up dust. "You should have listened when I said I wasn't interested," Clint said evenly. The leader gritted his teeth, but he didn't try to stand. His pride was hurt, but he knew he had been beaten, without a single wasted movement, without unnecessary violence. One of the remaining bikers, still sitting on his bike, swallowed hard before speaking. Who are you?" Clint didn't answer. He simply looked at them, then at the young biker who had held back from the confrontation. The kid stared at Clint with something different in his eyes, respect. Maybe even understanding. After a long moment, Clint turned back to the road, twisting the throttle. His bike roared to life, and without another word, he rode off into the night. The bikers stayed where they were, watching him disappear into the distance. The leader, still sitting in the dirt, let out a slow breath. That was Clint Eastwood. Silence fell over the group. The young biker looked in the direction Clint had gone, his expression unreadable. Something told him they'd just crossed paths with a legend. And none of them would forget it. The roar of Clint Eastwood's motorcycle faded into the night, but the moment hung thick in the air. The desert wind howled softly, kicking up dust around the group of stunned bikers. They weren't used to losing, and certainly not like this. No punches had been thrown, no weapons drawn, yet they had been completely outmatched. The leader, still catching his breath, finally stood up, dusting himself off. His face burned with embarrassment, but there was something else too, disbelief. He'd faced tough men before, but this was different. Clint Eastwood hadn't just beaten them. He had controlled the entire situation from the start, as if he had been playing chess while they were playing checkers. One of the bikers, a stocky man with a shaved head, finally broke the silence. What the hell just happened? The leader's jaw clenched. We ran into the wrong guy, that's what happened. The group shifted uncomfortably. They had come looking for trouble, expecting to push around an aging movie star, maybe get a few laughs at his expense. Instead, they had been outmaneuvered in a way they couldn't explain. The young biker, the one who had hesitated back at the diner, stood apart from the rest. He had watched the whole thing unfold, and unlike the others, he wasn't just thinking about the loss. He was thinking about the man they had just encountered. Clint Eastwood. The name alone carried weight, but tonight, the legend had come alive. The way he had handled himself, the discipline, the confidence, the sheer control, was unlike anything the young biker had ever seen. And it gnawed at him. He had spent years with this group, watching them bully their way through life. He had joined them because he wanted to feel strong, to be part of something. But tonight, watching Clint Eastwood, he had seen a different kind of strength. A quiet, controlled power that came from something deeper. And he couldn't shake the feeling that he had been following the wrong kind of men. The leader, still dusting himself off, turned to the group. We're not letting this go. The others looked at him, unsure. Boss, I don't know, one of them muttered. That guy, he's different. The leader's expression hardened. He embarrassed us. You want people to start thinking we're weak? No one answered. Thought so, he said, turning toward his bike. We find him. We settle this. The young biker's stomach twisted. He knew exactly what settling this meant. As the others revved up their engines, the young biker hesitated. Then, on impulse, he turned and walked away from his bike. the leader noticed. "Where the hell do you think you're going?" "I'm done," the young biker said, his voice steady. The group fell silent. The leader's eyes darkened. "What did you just say?" "I said I'm done," the young biker repeated, standing his ground. "I didn't sign up for this. You keep chasing trouble, but that guy, he's not the kind of man you mess with. And I'm not sticking around to find out what happens when you push him too far." The leader took a step closer, his fists clenched. "You don't just walk away from us." The young biker held his gaze. He had feared this moment for a long time, but now, standing here in the middle of the desert night, something had changed. For the first time in years, he wasn't afraid. "You do whatever you want," he said. "But I'm done." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked away, his heart pounding, but his steps firm. The other bikers watched, but none of them tried to stop him. Something about the way Clint Eastwood had handled himself had shaken them all, and for the first time, they were questioning everything. The young biker didn't know where he was going, but he knew one thing: he was heading in the opposite direction of the men he had once called brothers. And as he walked into the darkness, he couldn't shake one thought from his mind. He had just witnessed what real strength looked like. And he wanted to find it for himself. The young biker's footsteps crunched against the desert sand as he walked away from the group, his heart pounding harder with each step. He didn't look back. He couldn't. He knew that if he did, the leader would see it as weakness, as hesitation. And he couldn't afford to second-guess himself. Not now. The gang had been his life for years. They had promised strength, respect, and a sense of belonging. But tonight, in just a matter of minutes, Clint Eastwood had shattered everything he thought he knew about power. Strength wasn't about intimidation. It wasn't about brute force. It was about control. About knowing when to act and when to walk away. And now, for the first time, he was walking away. His bike was still back there. His only means of transportation. But he didn't care. He just needed distance, space to think. The cool night air stung against his skin as he made his way toward the highway, the sound of engines roaring behind him as the gang sped off in the opposite direction. They were going after Clint. And something deep in his gut told him they were making the biggest mistake of their lives. Miles ahead, Clint Eastwood rode steadily along the dark highway, the moon casting a pale glow over the open desert. He had no doubt the bikers weren't done with him. Men like that never let things go easily. He had seen their type before, young, full of pride, desperate to prove something. But proving something and being something were two different things. His grip on the handlebars was steady, his mind sharp. He had been in enough situations to know when trouble was coming, and he could feel it in the air. They would come for him. They would want payback. He had hoped they would let it go. But hope and reality didn't always line up. A pair of headlights appeared in his mirrors, then another. And another. The rumbling of engines grew louder behind him. Clint sighed. He wasn't in the mood for this. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, but he knew this road well. A few miles ahead, there was an old gas station, long abandoned. No cameras. No onlookers. If this was where things had to play out, it would be better there. He adjusted his speed, letting the bikers think they were closing in on him. They took the bait. The roar of engines surrounded him as they pulled up alongside him, their headlights cutting through the night. The leader was there, his expression hard, determined. The rest of the gang flanked him. Clint didn't acknowledge them. He just kept riding. The leader motioned for him to pull over. Clint ignored him. Frustrated, the leader swerved closer, nearly clipping Clint's bike. Now they were pushing it. Up ahead, the gas station loomed on the horizon, its faded neon sign barely flickering. Clint could see the cracked pavement, the rusted gas pumps standing like relics from another time. This would do. He slowed just enough to make them think they had control, then veered off the highway, pulling into the station. The bikers followed, their tires screeching against the pavement as they skidded to a stop. The night was silent except for the sound of engines cooling down, metal ticking in the cold air. Clint swung his leg over his bike and stood, stretching slightly as if he had all the time in the world. The leader dismounted too, his fists clenched. "You think you're real clever, don't you?" he spat. "Embarrassing us like that?" Clint met his gaze, calm as ever. "Wasn't my intention," he said simply. The leader scoffed. "Bull." Clint didn't argue. Arguments were for men who had something to prove. He had nothing to prove to these kids. "You made a mistake coming out here alone, old man," the leader continued, stepping closer. His hands flexed, itching for a fight. "Ain't no cameras. Ain't nobody gonna see what happens next." Clint studied him for a moment, then glanced at the others. They weren't as sure. They had seen what he could do. Their hands weren't as tight on their grips. Their stances weren't as firm. He wasn't dealing with a pack of wolves. Just scared boys pretending to be men. Clint sighed. "Let me tell you something," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Strength isn't about how loud you are. It isn't about how many people you have backing you up. Strength is knowing when you don't have to fight." The leader smirked. "That's supposed to scare me?" Clint shook his head. "It's supposed to teach you." The leader lunged. He was fast. But not fast enough. In a single, fluid motion, Clint sidestepped, using the leader's momentum against him. A slight shift of weight, a controlled movement, before the leader even knew what was happening, he was airborne, flipping over Clint's shoulder and landing hard on his back. The others tensed, their eyes wide. Clint didn't move. He didn't have to. The leader groaned, coughing as he struggled to get up. His hands shook as he pushed himself onto his elbows. He looked up at Clint, but this time, there was no arrogance in his eyes. Only realization. "You," he breathed, his voice hoarse. "Who the hell are you?" Clint studied him for a long moment, then finally spoke. "I'm just a man who learned a long time ago that fighting doesn't make you strong," he said. "But knowing how to fight? That's a different story." The bikers stood frozen, their confidence shattered. Clint didn't say anything else. He just walked back to his bike, swinging a leg over as if nothing had happened. He started the engine, the deep rumble filling the air. The leader sat there, still struggling to catch his breath, his mind racing. And for the first time in his life, he questioned everything he thought he knew about strength. As Clint pulled away from the gas station, disappearing into the night, the bikers were left standing in stunned silence. And somewhere down the road, the young biker, now alone, walked under the same moonlit sky, determined to find a different path. One that led to real strength. The night air was cool, crisp, and eerily quiet as Clint Eastwood rode away from the abandoned gas station. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew the lesson had been delivered. Whether the bikers chose to learn from it or not, that was up to them. The wind rushed past his face as he focused on the open road ahead. A lesser man might have felt a sense of victory, a thrill from putting those young punks in their place. But Clint felt no such thing. He had spent his life understanding the difference between power and wisdom. And wisdom had taught him that men like those bikers weren't really the enemy. They were just lost. Back at the gas station, the gang stood in stunned silence. Their leader was still on the ground, hands pressed into the rough pavement as he caught his breath. No one spoke. The air felt heavier than it had just minutes ago. For years, they had built their reputation on fear. They had ridden into towns expecting respect, not the kind that was earned, but the kind that was taken. They had never questioned whether they were strong. They had assumed they were. But tonight had changed something. The leader's hands clenched into fists as he pushed himself up. His body ached, his pride even more so. But what hurt the most was the realization he couldn't deny: Clint Eastwood had beaten him without ever throwing a real punch. His gang was waiting, watching. They wanted him to say something, to salvage whatever was left of his pride. But he had nothing to say. One of the bikers finally spoke up, his voice uncertain. "So, what now?" The leader didn't answer right away. He wiped the dust from his jacket, then looked toward the open road where Clint had disappeared. His mind was racing. He had always believed strength was about domination. That if you wanted to be feared, you had to be ruthless. But Clint had shown him something different. Something that shook him to his core. Real strength came from control. From knowing when to fight and when to walk away. From knowing who you really were. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he had ever really known. He exhaled sharply, then turned toward his bike. "We ride." The others exchanged glances, but didn't question him. They followed as he kicked up his stand and revved his engine. The leader didn't say where they were going, but he knew. They weren't chasing Clint anymore. They were chasing something bigger. Miles away, the young biker who had walked away from the gang trudged down the highway, hands in his pockets, head low. His legs ached, but he didn't care. For years, he had thought the gang was his only path in life. They had taken him in when no one else would. Given him a name, a reputation. But tonight had exposed an ugly truth: he had been following men who had no real strength. And now, he was alone. But maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. In the distance, headlights appeared. A lone motorcycle approaching, its deep, steady rumble familiar. He stepped to the side of the road, shielding his eyes from the glare. The bike slowed. The young biker's heart pounded as he recognized the man riding toward him. Clint Eastwood. Clint pulled his bike to a stop and cut the engine. For a long moment, he just studied the young man. "You got a long walk ahead of you," Clint finally said. The young biker swallowed hard. "Yeah." Clint nodded toward the empty road. "Where you headed?" The young biker hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't know." Clint seemed to consider this. Then, after a pause, he said, "Good." The young biker frowned. "Good?" Clint leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the handlebars. "Most men never admit when they're lost," he said. "That's what keeps them stuck." The words hit deeper than the young biker expected. He had spent years pretending to be tough, pretending to know exactly what he wanted. But standing here, face to face with Clint Eastwood, he realized how little he had figured out. Clint gestured toward the empty road ahead. "You got two choices. You can keep walking, hoping you find something better." The young biker swallowed. "And the other?" Clint tilted his head. "You can get on the bike." The young biker's heart pounded. He wasn't sure what Clint was offering, but something told him that whatever it was, it mattered. For the first time in years, someone wasn't forcing him to follow. They were giving him a choice. He looked down the road. It stretched endlessly into the darkness, unknown and uncertain. But maybe that was the point. Finally, he nodded. "All right." Clint motioned toward the back of the bike. "Then get on." The young biker hesitated only a moment before swinging a leg over. As the engine rumbled back to life, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. As they rode into the night, leaving the past behind, neither of them spoke. Because sometimes, the biggest lessons didn't need words. The night stretched before them, the road endless and quiet, the only sound the steady hum of Clint's motorcycle cutting through the still air. The young biker sat behind him, his grip firm but uncertain, as if he still wasn't sure whether he belonged on this ride. And truth be told, he wasn't sure. He had never followed anyone like this before, someone who didn't demand loyalty, didn't threaten consequences for stepping out of line. Clint hadn't asked him to get on the bike. He had given him a choice. And that was the most unsettling part. Because choices meant responsibility. For years, he had let others make decisions for him, whether it was the gang or just the circumstances of his life. He had drifted, following the path that had seemed easiest, the one that required the least thinking. But now, with the open road ahead, he had no idea where he was going. and yet, for the first time, that didn't scare him. After an hour of riding, Clint pulled off the highway onto a smaller, winding road leading into the hills. The young biker glanced around, realizing they were heading toward a secluded area, away from the city lights. The sky above was vast, stars spread across it like scattered diamonds. Eventually, Clint slowed the bike and pulled into a clearing near a worn-down wooden cabin. The place looked old but sturdy, the kind of place that had seen a lot of years and held a lot of stories. Clint killed the engine and stepped off the bike. The young biker followed, glancing around as Clint walked toward the cabin and pushed the door open without a second thought. Inside, the space was simple, no decorations, no distractions. A fireplace, a small wooden table, a single shelf lined with books, and an old punching bag hanging in the corner. The place smelled like wood and time. "You live here?" the young biker asked, his voice breaking the silence. Clint shrugged. "Sometimes." The young biker frowned. "Why bring me here?" Clint turned, his expression unreadable. "Because you didn't have anywhere else to go." That truth hit harder than expected. The young biker swallowed, glancing at the floor. "Yeah. I guess not." Clint motioned toward the fireplace. "There's firewood outside. Bring some in." The young biker hesitated. It wasn't a demand, it was an instruction, a test. Not of strength, but of willingness. With a small nod, he turned and stepped outside. As the fire crackled in the hearth, Clint sat in a worn-out chair, watching the flames flicker. The young biker sat across from him, still unsure of what this place was, what this moment meant. "You ever train?" Clint asked suddenly. The young biker frowned. "Train?" Clint nodded toward the punching bag in the corner. "Fight. Defend yourself." The young biker scoffed. "Yeah. I mean, kinda. The gang taught me how to throw a punch." Clint shook his head. "That's not training. That's survival." The young biker bristled. "Same thing, isn't it?" Clint's gaze was steady. "No. Training is discipline. Survival is desperation." The words made the young biker shift in his seat. He had never thought about it that way. He had spent his whole life fighting to get by, but had he ever really learned control? Clint stood and walked to the bag, giving it a slow, calculated tap. It swayed gently. "A fight doesn't start when someone throws a punch," he said. "It starts the moment you decide whether or not to let it happen." The young biker leaned forward. "So what, you're saying I should have just let people walk all over me?" Clint turned, meeting his gaze. "I'm saying knowing how to fight means knowing when you don't have to." Silence settled between them. Then Clint stepped back and gestured toward the bag. "Hit it." The young biker blinked. "What?" Clint didn't repeat himself. After a pause, the young biker stood, rolled his shoulders, and approached the bag. He took a breath, then threw a punch. It landed solidly, making the bag swing. He stepped back, waiting for Clint's reaction. Clint didn't look impressed. Again. The young biker frowned but did as he was told. Another punch. Then another. Clint watched in silence, then finally spoke. "Too much force. Not enough control." The young biker wiped his brow, annoyed. "What does that even mean?" Clint stepped forward, placing his hand lightly on the bag. "Strength isn't about how hard you hit. It's about how much power you can control. Right now, you're fighting angry. But anger burns out fast." The young biker clenched his jaw. "So what? I'm just supposed to hit soft?" Clint smirked. "No. You're supposed to hit right." Then, without warning, Clint shifted his stance, exhaled, and delivered a single, precise strike to the bag. It barely looked like he had moved. But the impact sent the bag swinging wildly. The young biker stared, stunned. Clint stepped back. "You can throw 100 sloppy punches. Or you can throw one that matters." The young biker swallowed hard. He had spent years believing power was about showing off, about making people fear you. But Clint had just shattered that belief in a single moment. The silence stretched again, and Clint finally motioned toward a small mat in the corner. Get some rest. We start at sunrise. The young biker hesitated. Start what? Clint turned away, stoking the fire. You'll see. The young biker didn't argue. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. As he lay on the mat, staring up at the wooden ceiling, he realized something strange. For the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of what tomorrow would bring. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees. The young biker stirred on the mat, his body stiff from sleeping on the hard floor. He blinked up at the wooden beams of the cabin's ceiling, momentarily disoriented, before the memories of the previous night rushed back. Clint Eastwood. The ride. The fire. The punching bag. And the promise, we start at sunrise. He sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and looked across the room. Clint was already awake, standing outside on the porch, stretching his arms as he gazed out at the endless expanse of hills and trees. There was something unshakable about him, a stillness that the young biker found both intimidating and reassuring. Clint didn't turn as he spoke. You ready? The young biker exhaled. He wasn't sure. But he nodded anyway. Good, Clint said, stepping off the porch and onto the dirt ground. Let's begin. For the next 2 hours, Clint took him through drills that didn't make sense at first. Breathing exercises. Slow movements. Balancing on one leg with his eyes closed. The young biker expected to be learning powerful strikes, how to move faster, hit harder. But Clint's method was different. It was about patience. Precision. Control. You're thinking too much, Clint finally said as he watched the young biker struggle to maintain a stance. You're waiting for the moment to hit, instead of feeling it. The young biker huffed in frustration. What's the point of all this? The gang doesn't fight like this. They don't care about balance or patience. They just swing until someone goes down. Clint gave a small, knowing smirk. And that's why they lose. The word stung. Because deep down, the young biker knew it was true. The gang's strength was all bark and no discipline. Their fights were fueled by anger, not skill. Clint stepped forward, standing in front of him. You wanted to know why I didn't hurt them that night? The young biker nodded. Clint's expression grew serious. Because I didn't have to. The young biker frowned. Clint held up a single finger. 1. That's all it takes. One moment, one decision, one action that changes everything. I had control. They didn't. The young biker swallowed, understanding settling in his chest. Clint motioned toward the punching bag again. Try again. The young biker took his stance. This time, he focused, not on hitting hard, but on hitting right. He exhaled slowly, steadied himself, and then delivered a sharp, clean strike. The bag swayed, not wildly, but with a focused impact. Clint nodded in approval. Better. For the first time, the young biker felt it. The difference. As the sun rose higher, Clint led him to a nearby stream, the sound of rushing water filling the air. They sat on the rocks, watching the current. The road you were on, Clint said, breaking the silence. Where do you think it led? The young biker shrugged. I don't know. Nowhere, I guess. Clint nodded. And the one you're on now? The young biker hesitated. That was the real question, wasn't it? For years, he had let others decide his path for him. He had followed because it was easier than leading. But now, sitting here, with Clint Eastwood of all people, he realized something. For the first time in his life, he had a choice. He could go back to the gang. He could fall into old habits, keep fighting meaningless fights, chasing a reputation that didn't matter. Or he could take the road less traveled. The one that required patience, discipline, strength, not just in his fists, but in his mind. He looked at Clint. "What would you do if you were me?" Clint smirked. "Doesn't matter. You're not me." The young biker exhaled. "Right." Clint patted the rock beside him. "You already know the answer." The young biker thought about that. Maybe he did. Later that afternoon, as they stood outside the cabin, Clint handed the young biker something small. A necklace. It was simple, just a small pendant, worn and old, but carrying a weight that felt heavier than it looked. "What's this?" the young biker asked. Clint gave a rare, soft smile. "A reminder." The young biker ran his fingers over the pendant. It wasn't flashy, but it meant something. Clint stepped back toward his bike, strapping on his gloves. "The road's open. Wherever you go next, make sure you're the one choosing it." The young biker nodded. As Clint started his motorcycle, the rumble filling the quiet space, the young biker took a deep breath. For the first time, he knew where he was headed. And it wasn't back to the gang. As Clint rode off, disappearing down the road, the young biker tightened his grip on the necklace and turned toward the horizon. It was time to start his own journey.